This is PD World. I am Syed SHABAHAT Ali and you are watching Fault Lines. The economic situation of Pakistan is under the radar of many international institutions. It is also a point of debate in almost all the domestic media that we have in the country. There are many speculations by different sides. Some believe that Pakistan is facing one of the worst economic crises of its economic history. There is another side of people or of experts who believe that everything is not lost. There is still a lot that can be done to bring Pakistan back into a comfortable economic zone, but for which a series of reforms is required. It is also said that whatever is happening with Pakistan in terms of economics is not only a domestic challenge or is not only taking birth of its political crisis, but also there are various international factors at play that are making the economic situation more haunting for the country. In order to understand this, in today's program, we are first going to take a quick stock take of Pakistan's macroeconomic situation, and then we are going to talk with an expert who will tell what exactly is going wrong with our economic policies. Team Fault Lines have prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
Pakistan's economy is facing strong headwinds, bowing to multidimensional internal and external crises such as political instability, fallout of Ukraine conflict, climate ravages, and global economic recession. In its annual report on state of Pakistan's economy, central bank has lowered its projected GDP growth from previously announced range of 3 to 4% for current fiscal year, citing flood-induced destruction. The report noted that delay in resumption of the IMF program and political instability exacerbated the country's vulnerability through the depletion of foreign exchange reserves. A concerted approach is required to encourage increased localization of the manufacturing base, along with lowering of energy intensity of the economy by ensuring energy efficiency and conservation. The government has devised a national contingency energy saving plan to stabilize the economy, conserve energy, and cut the import bill, which envisages measures like closure of markets and restaurants by 8 p.m., the work-from-home facility to 20% of government employees, the introduction of electric motorbikes, efficient light bulbs and fans, the solarization of government buildings, water conservation and rain harvesting. Pakistan's economy faces no immediate threat though, but global economic conditions are very challenging, with the IMF warning that the worst is yet to come. The country's policymakers are navigating the path ahead and making course corrections in time to stabilize the economy.
Ladies and gentlemen, my first guest in the program is joining me over the phone. He had to be originally in the studio, but then he was caught by some engagement and he's now joining me over the phone. Dr. Mahmood Khalid, he's Senior Research Economist for Pakistan Institute of Developing Economics. Dr. Mahmood Khalid, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
So we are talking about the macroeconomic situation of the country, and there are many people speculating that Pakistan is facing perhaps the worst economic crisis of its history. And there is a panic in the market. We see people rushing to buy US dollars. There are some people stockpiling groceries. We see a lack of confidence. Do you believe this situation is as threatening as the people are perceiving it to be at the moment?
Well, I would not say that it's exactly what the people are thinking about. But the issue is that how we are projecting it. Unfortunately, when things are not as what we expect, then we try to make the figure that it's the worst of its time and it's going to move towards a kind of a collapse situation. But on the other side, if you look at the size of our economy and the robustness in terms of how it withstands different kinds of shocks, there is substance in our economy, and it's not that dire a situation where the people should start thinking that we have to panic and we have to store the wealth in the form of buying gold and other kinds of currencies, because at the end of the day, the economy has to run even to manage their hoardings as well. So I don't take this argument that the people should really think about having a crisis situation of that extent, that where they feel that we are a kind of a failed economic state. Still, we are very vibrant. We have got a very good domestic consumption and production base, so we can sustain. But the prima facie, the face of the crisis looks like that we have actually moved to a position where our economic management has failed. But actually, this is not the case.
Dr. A trade deficit is one of the most worrying sides of the picture, and many are saying that Pakistan's trade deficit is actually the real elephant in the room. It's not the external payments that is the major problem, but is the inherent trade gap that we have inherited, perhaps, or that we are taking forward. So, how dire is the situation with regards to the trade deficit at the moment?
Well, actually, this is an issue. We are not saying that this is something which should not be taken into account. But if you look at the issue in terms of what it means, when we talk about the trade deficit, that means that we are actually selling less, or we are selling low quality products to the rest of the world, and we are importing more expensive or more quantum or bulk of the products from the rest of the world. Now, what happens is that it is basically pertaining to the incentives. If something is cheaper available to us, we're going to buy it from the rest of the world. But it does not mean that once we are unable to buy from the rest of the world, that things would not be provided within our country. I'll give you a quick example. Suppose if we were buying clothes from outside because of better quality or branding, now because it would not be available to us because the dollar is going to appreciate and depreciate and it's going to be more expensive, that means that production is going to be done within Pakistan. So over time, what has happened is that because we have kept our dollar not at that parity level which it should be, in other words, what we are saying is that our gap actually basically should have been dealt with some kind of a dollar adjustment that did not take place in the past. It has led to make our imports cheaper. And we have basically shifted our consumption base in terms of purchasing from the rest of the world. And even to say the inputs towards our domestic production was also purchased from the rest of the world. But that does not mean that we do not have the capacity to produce the same things which we are buying from the rest of the world. So what I foresee here is that once we would not be able to buy from the rest of the world, there is going to be a manufacturing surge within Pakistan, where the domestic producers are going to try to fill in that gap which has been created since we are unable to buy from the rest of the world because imports are going to be expensive. But the only thing is that we have to facilitate that transition where the domestic economy actually takes over the external demands which we have artificially created for the imported products from the rest of the world.
Dr. Saab, you're right. This has happened in case of Iran as well, which once went under sanctions. Its domestic sector actually started producing a lot of the products that it needed. But there are two other enemies to this situation. One is the situation of inflation that we are. Now, on official record, we are having an inflation rate of more than 20 to 24%. Correct me if I'm mistaken. And also the rate of interest that have gone so soaringly high that it's become very difficult for the domestic sector or the industrial sector to take soft loans, particularly the small startups that you're talking about. So don't you believe these are the hindrances that the government need to overcome before actually expecting the mushroom growth of small industry, as you pointed out?
You're right. I'm not saying that we should not take into account these structural issues. But the idea is that the government has to think about making some kind of policies which can facilitate that transition. You are very right that the interest cost has gone so up because the State Bank is trying to manage the inflation that it can impact our businesses as well. But if you look at our domestic business industry, it's not that much dependent on financing from the banking side. It's more dependent on how we are investing within Pakistan. So what we have suggested in our reports at PIDE as well is that we need to develop the investment culture within Pakistan, where the people actually take part in terms of providing for the required resources for our domestic production. I'll give you a quick example. Let's take the pension liabilities of Pakistan. Just take the federal government. It's around 600 billion, which is close to our salary budget. And if you include the rest of the provincial governments as well, it's close to 1 trillion rupees. So if we can convert that pension liability and convert it into a kind of a pension fund that can help in terms of providing for the resources required for our domestic production, it can help. We can develop our equity market where the people, instead of spending and investing in plots, they can invest in the businesses which are going to mushroom in terms of the import gap which is being created. So there are ways, but the only thing is that we have to now economically manage this crisis in terms of creating it as an opportunity where we move from one situation to a better situation rather than going into that situation by saying that it's not going to improve or we cannot do anything and
Dr.
the
Mahmood,
ship
Dr.
should
Mahmood,
sink.
don't you believe that the domestic borrowing is
Yeah.
one of the major problems that have not allowed our banking sector to facilitate the small scale industry? And if you agree with me on that, would you actually suggest some reforms by the government? Would the government be in a position to take any such measures that make domestic borrowing borrowing more easier from the banks for the small industries instead of government borrowing so much from the banks that banks are left hardly with any money to facilitate the small sector?
Well, actually, we had such an experiences in terms of the subsidized credits already. But the idea is that unfortunately, when the policies are made on paper, they look very good. But when it goes to the implementation, at the end of the day, they don't look into the objectivity or they don't look into the progress or the outcomes which has been delivered at the end of the day. So credit is one issue. But to me, even bigger issue as compared to the credit is the taxation. The way we are documenting our businesses or forcing them to pay the taxes at such higher and rates which are business context in that not affordable, we are trying to pursue a tax regime which is actually killing the businesses. Credit is one issue, and you are right that we need to develop such a credit policy for the small sector where they can provide for the resources. But to me, the credit is already available. The businesses can use them. The only thing which the government needs to do is to channelize these resources towards that. For example, our SMIDA is already providing for the credit. We have the microfinance banks which are providing credits which are cheaper and available to the small scale sector. But the issue is on the other side where we are trying to influence the businesses in terms of documentation and we are trying to pursue them in the name of false flagging for corruption and other elements that the businesses actually are reluctant to go ahead. So once we create the business friendly or the investment oriented climate, then they're going to turn up with resources and the mechanisms where they can flourish.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmood Khalid, for being guest in our program today. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Dr. Mahmood Khalid, and he has highlighted that nonetheless, the economic challenges are paramount in nature. Pakistan is not facing any immediate risk of defaulting on its debts. It is rather a high time for undertaking macroeconomic reforms, few of which he has just highlighted. We'll take a break and we'll join you back with second segment of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back. And ladies and gentlemen, as you heard in the first segment of the program, we spoke about the broader macroeconomic challenges that Pakistan is facing at the moment, as well as the domestic environment that is giving birth to all these economic challenges. But nonetheless, we are not an isolated nation. We are a member of the international community, and thereby we are a member of the larger economic order that exists in the world. What are the external factors? What are the external factors that are affecting our economy at large? What policy reforms are required to be taken in this situation that Pakistan is facing at the moment, given the international factors that we have just highlighted? I have invited an international economist, and we are so fortunate to have him today in this studio. He was on a visit of the country, and I requested him to be our guest in studio. I'm very thankful to Dr. Adil Malik, who teaches economics at University of Oxford. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
We are talking about this larger economic and international environment, not only economic but other challenges as well that Pakistan is facing at large. What external factors do you see at play affecting countries like Pakistan at the moment?
Well, the big factor is really economic, and it is interlinked with geopolitics. The larger economic issue is really the commodity super cycle. Oil prices have risen globally. Wheat prices have risen globally. A lot of countries coming out of COVID are suffering from debt. So the IMF has become very busy across the world. There's a global inflationary cycle, I mean in United Kingdom as well. I have never seen such a sharp uptick in consumer prices. So those challenges are not unique to Pakistan, they are global as well. But there's a particular domestic and geopolitical angle to Pakistan's troubles which get exacerbated in the wake of shocks.
Now, when you talk about these economic factors that you just highlighted, there is a commodity super cycle, which essentially, to our understanding, comes out of the war between Russia and Ukraine. This is the trigger point, and then it has been taken up by all these economies that were already struggling. To our understanding, there is a bit of role of this global warming as well that is actually playing a horrifying scenario has been generated in many countries of sub-Saharan Africa as well. How do you see this economic super cycle hitting economies like that of Pakistan that are partially independent of international factors? I mean, we grow a lot of food that we consume.
Right. So I think there's a larger lesson from economic theory. Shocks, global shocks, hit many, many developing countries in Africa, Latin America, South Asia, Pakistan being one of them. But the way countries respond to those shocks depends on their underlying institutional structures, how resilient they are. It's sort of very similar with individuals because different individuals are exposed to different personal shocks, but the way they respond to those shocks depends on their domestic institutional capacities.
And with regards to oil, we also see that a lot of problems have triggered with Russia-Ukraine war taking place, with sanctions on Russia, with war going on in many other areas where oil exists, like Syria, like Iran is under sanctions, like Libya is in the state of war. So does that actually create a further problem? Does that actually add into the crisis that the world is facing?
Absolutely. I mean, just to connect with what you asked before, I think the floods, which is a key environmental catastrophe, has clearly fed into this inflationary cycle. So a lot of the inflationary trends that we are seeing in Pakistan are partly driven by floods because that has also destroyed crops. But in terms of these global crises, yes, there are these immediate antecedents in terms of these wars, particularly the standoff with Russia on the issue of Ukraine. I think that we are passing through a phase where we are moving in a disruptive way in terms of international relations from a unipolar world where America was the leading superpower of the world to a multipolar world. In that state of transition, there's heightened uncertainty and risk aversion on the part of these global powers who do not want to see alternative powers like China to take control of world affairs. And in that context, Pakistan is sort of boxed into a very, very difficult situation because we have historically enjoyed very close relations with the West, Britain and United Kingdom and United States in particular, but also China because of our geography. And so we are put in a very difficult situation where we have to make decisions that may not appeal to one or the other party. And that, I think, is further adding further complication to our economic situation.
And all of this has perhaps made the significance of OIC's countries more visible for us. We have seen them, I'm assuming their economies must be thriving under oil being sold on such high price. Would you agree with me on that?
Yes, so within the Middle East, there's not one Middle East, there are two Middle Easts, as I wrote in a recent paper. There's a Middle East that derives its income and revenues from oil. They are flushing with oil revenues now because their oil prices have risen. But there are other countries, the likes of Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, whole range of other countries that do not export oil in large quantities. And so they are very much in the situation that Pakistan finds itself, which is that they have to import oil and food at very high cost. Egypt being the prime example, where much like Pakistan, it had to devalue currency, it is facing growing economic strains, it has to find a recourse to revenues, global oil, global dollar shortage as well that they're facing. So they have to fill up their reserve by making a recourse to the IMF or many of these Gulf countries. And one issue that really affects countries like Egypt and Pakistan is that we are passing through a phase where interest rates on the dollar are very high. So for anybody to lend money to countries like Pakistan and Egypt, is more difficult. And let me explain why. In normal circumstances, a lot of the Sukuk bonds that Egypt and Pakistan issued, US interest rates were low. Pakistan and Egypt offer very high interest rate. Yes, there is of course risk of investing in emerging markets, but even if you were to account for that risk, you get very high returns. Now, situation is changing because now the US interest rate is going up, considerably, which means for an ordinary investor, it is quite profitable to buy US Treasury stocks with hardly any risk.
But why
compared to
US's
Egypt.
rates are going up? How do you explain that?
So there are a number of different factors involved, but typically when oil prices are high, rates go up. Also, there are a lot of domestic factors involved in terms of you're coming out of COVID. There's an inflationary cycle. In order to control inflation, US interest rates have to go up because within their own macroeconomic stability, you need to have monetary policy respond to that. All of these countries are going through an inflationary cycle. In the US, for example, oil prices and the prices of consumer goods have risen by a lot more than any time in the last decade. So they have to respond, and one way to respond for them, especially for Fed, is to increase interest rates. But of course, the dollar is a global reserve currency. If they raise interest rates, it becomes more profitable for bond buyers and those who want to invest in US Treasury market to invest there rather than in the likes of Egypt and Pakistan. So we are passing through a very, very difficult stage.
So we have to offer more.
We have to offer more in order to compensate for the risk, but you can understand that the international situation is particularly worrisome now because you have geopolitical competition between China and the United States. You are just coming out of COVID. You are just passing through a commodity super cycle with the Ukraine war coming in, and then also the global conditions in terms of investment and higher dollar interest rates.
And Dr. Why would you not factor in the devaluation of currency that we are facing? Because just in last 1 year, as I keep traveling abroad, we have personally observed a decline of 45%, 45 to 50% of the value of rupee has been lost in just last 1 year versus US dollar. Doesn't it make these loans further more expensive because Pakistan is generating its wealth in PKR and paying back in USD with a higher rate of interest that you just highlighted?
Absolutely. But I think we have to ask a more fundamental question, which is what is making the currency lose its value? And that's the fundamental question we should ask. And it's because there's a greater demand for dollars relative to the supply that we have, right? So the similar shocks are hitting countries like Bangladesh, for example, whose exports have fallen, who have to conserve, Bangladesh has been trying to conserve energy by restricting the import of oil. Their currency has also fallen a little bit, but they have larger cushion of reserves. And that cushion of reserves comes from greater supply of dollars because their exports are higher than our exports. So I think fundamentally the debate in this country is problematic because whether it's from the highest level to the lowest level, it's all about how can we control dollar, which obviously is an important political issue because it affects people like you and me. But I think the real question we should be asking, how can we make our economy more export oriented so that we have abundant supply of dollars which will cushion our currency.
And Dr. We also spoke about, while listing out the economic factors in while responding to my first question, you spoke about debt as well. Now, isn't it a fact that when too many of the people who owe you are not able to pay back, it actually becomes a problem for you as well as a person or institution that is lending money to others? As you have listed out a number of countries, or pointed out at least a couple of them that are unable to pay or are feeling it increasingly difficult to pay, is it a point of worry for institutions like IMF as well?
It is indeed. I mean, we have a structure of debt which can worry a lot of indebtors, less the IMF, but more creditors like the private markets or those who have invested in our Sukuk. But I think fundamentally the risk of default as far as the lender is concerned has changed dramatically over the last 50 years. There was a time when if the debtor is unable to pay back debt, you will have warships coming to their shores and trying to reclaim debt. But now the international relations have changed in a way that if you default or if you do not pay your debt, you are cut off in so many different ways that it incentivizes rulers of these developing countries not to default. Otherwise, that's the way. I mean, now there's more discussion about rescheduling of debt or restructuring of debt, reprofiling of debt, rather than not paying any debt at all.
Coming back to the suggestion that you have raised, you have also spoken about some policy shifts that countries like Pakistan should consider while making a strategy to steer out of the crisis that we have in hand. What exact strategies do you believe need an utmost revival at the moment?
Pakistan is facing a multi-pronged crisis. You have a deep governance crisis, inherent political instability, lack of direction, education. I can name lots of things, but I think fundamentally what we need at this stage is to make an incentive environment which is good for production, right? Over the last 20 years, we have gradually tilted the focus of our economy away from production to consumption. And that's been led by a boom in the real estate sector, which creates, dramatic returns in very short period of time without really adding a lot to the jobs. And it creates patterns of consumption which require you to import, right? So if you're building a house in Islamabad, you would see people are importing stuff from Italy, Italian tiles, Malaysian this, Chinese products, right? There's a lot of this huge demand for consumer goods, which is being driven not by a sector that brings in dollars, but a sector that is really claiming on a finite resource, which is land. There's also a bigger problem that this type of incentive structure disincentivizes production, especially exports. Because imagine if you are an exporter or a manufacturer or a factory owner, you have to incur a whole range of costs. You have to incur a lot of risk in order to earn money, right? Why would you do that? You'd much rather buy 4 or 5 plots, commercial plazas, and you will have an assured return. Now, we have to gradually shift the structure of our economy away from more consumption-oriented, speculative real estate focus to more productive enterprises where we are producing goods for the world.
You're talking about manufacturing?
I'm talking about manufacturing, and I'm talking about also the recent paper that I wrote, which has been circulated widely on the internet, which is about our trade policy, that our trade policy is a huge anti-export bias in the sense that, typically we impose very high taxes on imports, right? And a lot of these high taxes on imports become taxes on exports because a lot of the exporters need to import those products. Secondly, we have a lot of exemptions. Our trade policy regime is very convoluted, it's very complex. Typically, in developing countries, you have a slab of 1 to 25%, tax rate, which is basically tariffs, taxes on imports. What we have instead is a huge variation in these taxes. There are many sectors that are exempted from those taxes. There are huge concessions that are offered to some sectors, not to others. And in my research, I found that a lot of these sectors are actually those sectors that have actors who are politically connected or who have a lot of political voice. Whichever government is in power, it's not really about one government, whichever government is in power, these powerful sectors, powerful groups who operate in these sectors end up getting differential higher level of protection. So a classic example is the manufacturing of cars. We have the sugar sector. We have a whole range, even within textile. Unless we move away from that protective structure, simplify our trade regime, make it more profitable to people to invest in exports, we cannot really solve our problem. So a lot of the households who don't know about this economic logic, let me explain in a very different way. When we sit in our middle class households in Islamabad, Lahore, Rawalpindi, we usually talk about, cousins are coming and saying, I bought a plot in, E11, or I bought something in Bahria Town, or I bought something in DHA. People are comparing notes that, I bought the plot at this price and now the price escalated. Imagine a time when people are talking about, I set up an IT firm and, it's now exporting $2 billion, or I set up a factory and now it's exporting goods to this and that, right? That will change the nature of conversations. These are the conversations that are taking place in typical middle class, upper middle class households in China. I'm supervising a Bangladeshi student and he's working on industrial upgrading in Bangladesh. same conversations are taking place there. You know, there's a city called Ghazipur, which was a small backward town, small agrarian operations in that town, and gradually it moved into manufacturing of textiles. Now it's upgrading. Now they are bringing in Samsung to manufacture products. So I think we have to change the nature of these conversations, but there's a political challenge in it, because the same sector, the real estate, which disincentivizes you to produce, to undertake risk, to expand production in this country and export, is a sector which is very politically powerful. A lot of the powerful people in this country are hugely invested in that sector, and they get easy returns.
Doctor, but don't you think that the high prices of energy, particularly in a country like Pakistan that is starving for gas as well, which is one of the major inputs for many industries, and the high level of taxes that we are imposed by institutions like IMF, who dictate us to make the tax slab higher. If you compare in terms of US dollars, we are paying 40-45% tax if your income is 2,000 USD, which is maybe insane for many in the West. Aren't these hindrances for us to do what you are just saying? Instead of just shifting a policy, don't you think that the tax slabs as well as the electricity costs that are being dictated by institutions that we owe money to are actually issues that we need to look after?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a great question. I mean, in a way, all of these are interlinked. One of the most important inputs for exporters is electricity. But I think in many cases, it's not just the cost, it's stable supply of electricity and gas. A lot of the countries that have produced products for the global world, right, for the global economy, are countries that have consistently provided these cheap inputs. I think, of course, the IMF is going to come and say, manage your fiscal house in order. There are certain things that we need to undertake. There are some difficult political reforms we need to take in the energy sector. There are plenty of good experts in Islamabad, in Karachi, everywhere in Pakistan, even overseas, who know what exactly ails Pakistan's energy sector. What we require is a political resolve to undertake those reforms. But I would say that geopolitical situation is also very difficult for Pakistan.
Let's come on the geopolitical, because you listed that out in the first, while responding to my first question. What geopolitical challenges do you believe are specific in nature for Pakistan and are haunting us the most?
I think the big challenge that Pakistan faces is that its geography dictates that it should have good relation with China, it should have good relation with Iran, it should have good relation with Afghanistan, and also to some extent with India. But there are different opposing forces, right? We are now entering into a geopolitical struggle where China is pitted against India, right? And so the West often sees us through the lens of that competition. I think in order to take our country forward, we need a new geopolitical bargain where we bring all our international partners on the table. It could be the Gulf countries, UAE, Saudi Arabia, China, Iran, America, United Kingdom, and we need to sit with them and tell them, look, we are a country of 220 million people. Unless we generate opportunities for them, provide them regular, stable, cheap access to electricity and gas and trading opportunities, we will have huge trouble in this country. It's not sustainable. Help us. We are not playing your geopolitical game, but you have to give us this concession. Now, this is important because, remember, one of the cheapest source or more stable source of gas is next door in Iran. It's the world's second largest exporter of gas. Why can't that gas be connected with the households for industry? The problem in that context is that we have multiple friends in the region. If we buy something from Iran, we are considered as pro-Iranian, we are interfering in the geopolitical struggle. So I think we need to have more candid discussion with our international partners. And the way last year I posed it in Margala Dialogue, the American ambassador was sitting there. I said, look, we have a large coastline. We are not a landlocked country, but effectively we operate as a landlocked country of Africa. We are not trading with India. Afghanistan we cannot trade, it's uncertain, huge.
With Iran we cannot.
With Iran we cannot. And with China, if we engage, there is a problem. So I asked the audience, and there were many international community members were sitting there. I said, then I want to seek your permission that the 220 million people of Pakistan should probably commit suicide, or maybe they should just throw themselves into the Indian Ocean. That's the choice we have, and we have to present that choice to our international partners and tell them, look, we are boxed in a very difficult situation. You need to give us concessions.
But Dr. Shah, this is very pertinent to understand that. I would want to understand it, taking advantage of your presence, that for what you are saying, we first of all require a relief by the organizations, by these international lender organizations that we owe this money to. Because they come and they sit with our finance teams and they dictate us. This is all, this much tax we need out of here because we owe them a huge amount of money that you just said. It's not possible for any country not to pay that. So don't you believe that apart from talking to the countries that you have highlighted, which by the way have a conflict of interest with each other, isn't it also important to have an eyeball-to-eyeball dialogue with institutions like IMF, and if so, would they be willing to allow us to take such gigantic reforms?
I mean, we do talk to them, and I think at the moment our finance minister is having a very tough conversation with the IMF team. That's why the IMF program is stalled, because there are certain commitments that we are not making, we are not agreeing to. Absolutely, we need to have that, but don't forget that a lot of these international institutions are also controlled by these great powers. Increasingly, we know that the United States is a key stakeholder in the International Monetary Fund, but also IMF has not been giving money to Egypt and Pakistan unless there is a nod from our Gulf partners. It's making it conditional with our Gulf partners that, you know, if you get money from Saudi Arabia, then we will give. So there's a lot of international coordination. And
it's vice versa as well. Saudi Arabia is also saying the same. If you take money from IMF only, then never program continues.
Absolutely. And so what we are finding in this new situation is greater coordination behind the scenes between different lenders, bilateral lenders as well as multilateral lenders. So I think that is important, but I would also highlight that there are certain things that the IMF does not stop us from doing. For example, there are huge, massive tax exemptions in Pakistan. You know, the state is not economically viable, right? India's tax to GDP ratio is almost double that of ours, right? We can easily increase the tax to GDP ratio from 9% to 20%. But in order to do that, we have to bring those individuals and sectors into the tax net who are politically powerful and who resist any attempt to reform the tax system. And nobody is stopping us from implementing those reforms.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aldeen Malik, for this very wonderful conversation that we had. Ladies and gentlemen, we had this conversation that tells us that everything is not lost. We still have a hope. We still have people like him. And as he said, there are many in Islamabad and Pakistan as well that can help our country to steer out of the crisis that we are facing at the moment. It is now up to the government and the resolve of the political leadership of the country. Would they be able to steer us out of the crisis that we have? We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.